Welcome to Conservative Solutions for Our Common Challenges. I'm Dan Albus, the Member of Parliament for Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna, from the beautiful interior of British Columbia. This podcast is about the people who take their lived experience, their principles, their determination, and turn them into practical ideas to make Canada safer, stronger, and more resilient. These conversations inspire me because no matter how complex the issue is, there are always Canadians willing to stand up with purpose and with integrity, and I hope these conversations inspire you too. Today, I'm sitting down with someone who embodies that sense of service, Alex Ruff, Member of Parliament for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound. Before public life, Alex served Canada for over 25 years as an infantry officer with the Canadian Armed Forces, deploying multiple times overseas and leading teams into some of the most difficult environments imaginable. Since arriving in Parliament, he's continued that commitment to service, whether it's through his legislative work, his efforts to strengthen democratic resilience, or his role on the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, better known as NSICOP. Alex also has a private member's bill aimed at improving accountability and transparency within key areas of federal jurisdiction, and we're going to talk about some of his motivations behind that as well. Alex, welcome. Thanks for coming to our podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's great to be here.
Well, before we get into some of the security and legislative issues, how are you doing these days? What's keeping you occupied as a member of Parliament?
Well, lots keeping me busy. You've hinted already that I'm a member of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, so that committee is a great committee to be on, keeping me super busy because we don't get the same limelight except when our reports get published, because we do a lot of the stuff behind the scenes and it's all done at a classified level, normally at the top secret level. So we got to go into a special room, no devices, no phones, to read this classified information, prepare for the appearances of many of the officials. And so we're just going through that. In fact, when we're done today, I got to go do a pile of reading before we have an appearances showing up on Thursday this week. Where we're going to go into depth, because we're just trying to finish a study off on the role of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor of Canada, which has never been studied or reported on before. As well, I'm quite actively busy with some of our parliamentary associations. In particular, the one I'm mainly focused on is Canada-NATO. Mm-hmm. So I had the privilege with a number of our colleagues across all parties, including senators, to head over to Brussels just this past week to attend the annual general meeting for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So obviously lots of discussions going on how, the strength and challenges that NATO is currently facing, in particular in supporting Ukraine as they combat Russia's illegal invasion, as well as the unique challenges that with the U.S. reposturing and their forces, and how that's going to mean for all NATO allies to sort of pick up the slack and make sure they're meeting their NATO commitment of 2% of GDP. But as a lot of your listeners are likely aware, all the NATO countries signed on last year to getting to 3.5% of their GDP on core defense capabilities, with another 1.5% on ancillary capabilities or more. And then what else keeps me busy? I'm a single dad half the time, so I got a 12-year-old that's active in a lot of sports and school activities, so that keeps me very busy too.
Wow, well, it's amazing all the things you're able to balance. But going back to the event in Brussels, what do you think really caught your attention?
There was nothing as surprising this spring for me or last week. It's been a fairly consistent message. But one of the quotes that one of the other parliamentarians, I can't remember which nation, brought up, it's NATO becomes more real the further east you go. So our Baltic countries that are sort of bordering with Russia have been, there's no lack of understanding of the risks and threats that Russia poses along with other potential adversaries. So Finland's a great example. They've only joined NATO fairly recently. However, I met with a Finnish MP of the European Union. He was actually part of their normal, their parliament prior to being elected as one of their Finnish MPs in the European Union. But when you've been attacked something like, or invaded a dozen times over the last 400 years by Russia, their understanding of what the threat and the risks to their people are They don't have their eyes are wide open. That's why many of those nations still have obligatory service or some version of conscription. And they are already at, and some of them are already exceeding the 5% of their GDP. So I think that's the key challenge. I actually met with Lieutenant General Greg Smith, a former colleague of mine, good friend of mine, who's our senior Canadian rep at NATO, and the national military rep for Canada. And it was my challenge to him and ask to him is that I don't think parliamentarians back here in Canada, in particular us as members of parliament, that have to tell our constituents, our voters, why it's important to be contributing some of their very hard-earned tax dollars to issues like national defense, support for Ukraine, etc. I feel I'm better armed than some of our colleagues just because of my military background. But I think NATO could do a better job. Not the current Canadian government, they have a role to play in this, but I actually think NATO can do a better job as an alliance of arming parliamentarians across the alliance with sort of those key talking points and understanding the risks and threats that Russia, their alliance with China and North Korea, what this means for Canadian or in general Western freedom and democracy, and as well as just our economic security. So there's an underlying thread to all of this that I think we need to do a better job, and that it would help us as representatives of the Canadian people to do our job in making them understand why it's important to find that balance between not only taking care of legitimate economic concerns here domestically, but at the same time why Canada should still play a key role on the international stage.
Well, it seems, Alex, that because of a lot of your background, you seem to be well-versed in how these issues, again, military has both a domestic, obviously, sovereignty component, but also working with international groups like NATO. For someone who served our country for more than 2 decades in uniform, when you look back, what first drew you to that military service, and what are some of those lessons that still guide you as you go to the forums like Brussels and some of these other important committees you're part of?
So, reality, I'm a farm boy from a small village outside the village of Tara, where I live on the home farm still. It's involved in sports, very active and stuff like that at high school, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. To be frank, I still haven't figured that out. I'm just, so didn't come from a lot of money, very modest background. So I knew that I needed to go and choose to do something that, I could sort of make do on my own. And so when the Royal Military College came, the recruiters came around, and I had no background in the cadets or in the militia or the primary reserves. My grandfather had been a bomber pilot in World War II. My great-grandfather, who I never knew, was a runner in World War I. So I do have a history of military service within the greater extended family. But it was just something that really piqued me, was the idea of challenging myself. And I've always been one of those individuals not afraid to push yourself. And the fact that they were going to cover my education while I went and got a university degree, I think was one of the overriding factors. But it was really that idea of serving and making a difference. And so zero regrets, absolutely loved my military career, as you hinted at. It really, right from basic training through recruit term at the Royal Military College to all my infantry phase training, every level of it's pushing you at the individual level to find out your own limitations and strengths and weaknesses, whether it's physical, mental, or academically, but at the same time, the importance of working together as a team. And so all of that sort of led together, the experiences that I got, 2 tours in Bosnia, peacekeeping, but it was those key leader engagements with local Bosniak political leadership, military leadership that actually armed me that, surprisingly enough, when I went to Afghanistan on my first tour and was leading a combat team for 6 months in combat. But again, it's a counterinsurgency, not your typical, World War II where you're fighting a pure enemy. And so I swear sometimes we were fighting the Taliban, and some of those people I might have been fighting against in the morning, in the afternoon, I might have been talking to some of the same ones in what's called a Shura or a key leader engagement, trying to understand what the underlying concerns and risks are, and how convincing them why Canada and our forces that were on the ground, all under a NATO flag as well, to that we're just there to try to give the Afghan people a better opportunity. And even us at that point, even in combat, we understood the long-term sustainability to Afghanistan wasn't in the military fight against the Taliban, but it was actually in the reconstruction and trying to change the sort of their form of governance and allowing them to sort of do it on their own. And that's why I was back there in 2012 with the Canadian contribution to the training mission in Afghanistan. It was so important because we recognized then that this is about giving them that institutional capabilities and capacity building to sort of do it on their own. And a great example, even on that tour, we took one of the regional military training centers, which was bringing new conscripts in and teaching them how to fight. We recognized we don't need to teach them how to fight. A lot of these young men have been fighting already for a decade. They knew how to handle a firearm. However, a lot of them didn't know how to read or write to a grade 3 level. So we actually stopped training them on military tactics and started giving them literacy training so they could read and write and count to a grade 3 level, because that helps obviously remove corruption within their own system. And unfortunately, as we saw in 2021 with the, Canada pulled out in 2014, but when the U.S. pulled away in 2021, the collapse, unfortunately, of the democratic elected government in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are back in control. But I'm still optimistic that we have over a decade of women and girls and democracy sort of starting, the fledgling democracy there, that some of that leadership will eventually come back and the Afghan people will recognize that. And then it just sort of builds as you move up in rank. So by the time my final tour was in Iraq as part of the ministerial liaison team under the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq, with about 79 different countries partaking in that mission against Daesh or ISIS. But really the role I was part of was advising their Ministry of Interior, which is the same as our Ministry of Public Safety, and their Ministry of Defense, on how to sort of function at that governance level about, putting the pieces in place. So all of that really helped inform me and shape me that now as a politician, I see the challenges and the risks that if we don't have a strong, free, transparent, accountable democratic system that we are privileged to have in Western countries like Canada, the risk that can happen. So it informs me. It's why I obviously was drawn more to federal politics than provincial or municipal politics. But it was a tough decision to make the decision to retire basically 10 years early and jump into politics. But zero regrets, other than I miss the people and the camaraderie. But absolutely believe it's enabled me with a good background to try to at least continue to make a difference now in service. I just don't have to shave every day, and I don't have to wear a uniform anymore.
Well, it sounds like many of the lessons that you've seen, and you've seen probably some of the best cases as well as some of the worst cases. What are some of the things, are there any golden threads that you've drawn from your time, whether it be from peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, supporting the fight against Daesh? What do you think Canada excels at, and what should we be striving to improve on?
So what Canada really strives on, despite us not being, geographically one of the largest countries in the world, but from a military or population base, not even close, is our training, and it's just the common sense and the common people. We train our soldiers, and I'll say this, even though this might create a little bit of angst, is I'd take one trained infantry Canadian soldier over 10 American soldiers. Americans have some phenomenal capabilities, some phenomenal leadership, and obviously their strength is just their size and capacity. But we really have a really good training system for our Canadian Armed Force personnel. Obviously, I'm biased towards the Army, but it's our senior non-commissioned officers, or NCOs, that really do a phenomenal job. So where we have that sort of level of experience and advice coming from our senior NCOs to our officers, we tend to command and have people that with a lot more experience before we thrust them into some of those positions. So that, I think, pays dividends when you're dealing with whatever type of operation that we've deployed Canadians around the globe on. But from a a leadership perspective that I think, has helped me. It's the understanding that you're only as strong as the team and as those people below, and you need to harness that. Like, I think that was one of the key lessons I learned as a combat team commander in Afghanistan, is understanding that everybody's got something that they can offer to the fight or to the operation, and not trying to pigeonhole certain people into certain roles. And I think there's a great example of that even in politics. It's the strength of our team and the Conservative benches is we've got some incredible talent right across, and I think we need to do a better job, and I think this is something your podcast here, I think, will help advertise to Canadians, is that we have people from different backgrounds across the spectrum within our Conservative caucus that can demonstrate and help continue to make a difference to make Canada's democracy even stronger.
Well, and just speaking about, the team and different roles, you've been thrust into a much different role because at this point I wanted to talk to you about NSICOP. For listeners who may not know what it is, how would you explain that role and the purpose of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians?
So it was a committee relatively new, and it's something that actually was stood up under former Prime Minister Trudeau back in the 2017 timeframe, and it's to review and provide that oversight of all our national security and intelligence agencies. It's something that's never existed really before. There was a thing called the CIRC, and I can't even remember what the acronym, but I think the Security Intelligence Review Committee, and it wasn't comprised of parliamentarians or anything like that, but it's the idea that we can take parliamentarians, both senators and MPs, and provide that oversight. We all have to get and hold a top secret security clearance, so that's something that in the way the Act is currently enabled, we have to actually waiver parliamentary privileges, swear an oath, something, because I've had a top secret security clearance for decades now, something that I'm sworn to secrecy on certain issues for the rest of my life, that you can't talk about certain things, and, about the specifics around how we've really around, and I can explain this a little bit later, Dan, if you want, about how security clearances work. But ultimately, the role of NSICOP is to provide that overview and review. So they've done everything from one of their first studies was the concerns around then Prime Minister Trudeau's trip to India and some of the alleged misgivings there with some of the shortfalls that happened around intelligence leaks, to all sorts of looking at all the different sort of main agencies. The ones that I've personally been involved with, obviously the big one is the Foreign Interference Report. I was one of the co-authors of that report that highlighted the concerns we had, and the uniqueness as parliamentarians, different than the public inquiry that was done by Justice Hogue, now Deputy Minister Hogue, we looked at it from that view as parliamentarians, especially for those of us that are MPs, and it's why we chose specific language in that public report about witting and unwitting parliamentarians. We studied the federal mandate of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We've looked at, as I said, right now we're looking at the role of the National Security and Intelligence Advisor. So there's all these different, in the last report that we tabled last year was on lawful access and trying to, put out there to Canadians and to the government and to parliamentarians why, our law enforcement agencies need sort of that ability to lawfully intercept communications, because unfortunately our laws haven't been really updated since the landline telephone. That's how outdated some of our legislation is.
Wow. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about security clearances and the foreign interference. Before that, I just wanted to ask a little bit. NSICOP has a really unique structure. So top secret clearances, broad access to classified information, but firm limits, no cabinet confidences, no protected sources, no ongoing law enforcement investigations. How do those guardrails shape the kind of oversight and accountability that NSICOP can realistically deliver?
So it's a great question. I think there's definitely tweaks. I think this is something that, now Defense Minister McGuinty, who was the longtime chair of NSICOP, had put in some of his letters about the question of cabinet confidence. And to be fair to the Liberal government, they did provide some of the cabinet confidence documents around foreign interference, the same ones that they had provided to former Governor General Special Rapporteur David Johnston and to Justice Hogan in the public inquiry into foreign interference. But that's one of the things that, as the NSICOP Act, which is already overdue its mandated review, it's actually, when that review comes up, I think that is something Parliament, both from across parties, will look at, because I think that is sort of it's not about the advice, the political advice. We have zero interest in that. It's about when something's going on, that's that discussion within cabinet of why they're not progressing down certain paths that they're going to, help with their national security in Canada. And if that decision's being held up at cabinet, I think some of that could be more beneficial. But I actually think we've got it. There's been rumors in the media and different allegations about, the Prime Minister's redacted certain. I will attest right now, and I've done this at the Senate committee when the foreign interference report, I'm not aware of a single example in the history of the committee that anything's ever been redacted for partisan or political purposes. Everything's has a very stringent redaction process in place. And in reality, when you read the redacted public version of one of our reports, and if you were to read it word for word, or against the unredacted version, in reality, the message is never changing. The only thing you're lacking is specifics, case examples sometimes, that really protects how our national security and intelligence organizations have really obtained that information or that intelligence, or to protect some of our relationships too with either allies, or to ensure adversaries don't understand some of the capabilities or capacities or sources that we as Canada, or that if the information or intelligence came from an ally, that we're protecting that capability so that we don't lose it, because that's the risk sometimes. If you can't protect this information, you're going to lose or put people at risk, or capabilities that are sometimes very expensive to develop. To be frank, I actually think NSICOP's been very successful. I think one of the key elements of that success can be attributed to two things. One, everything's done in a skiff. We can be frank, honest with each other. There's no cameras. We're getting the facts. The other thing is that committee has never had a vote yet. Everything in those reports, despite being represented by all the recognized parties and by the senators, it's unanimous. So we've had come up with a finding or a recommendation. We are in complete agreement with that, which I think adds to the strength of our reports, because it's just not one party saying something, whether it's the government party, whether it's one of the opposition parties. We are united in that we've looked at this. We debate stuff very at length, but we don't have to worry about being misinterpreted, and neither do those government officials that appear, whether sometimes it is the government themselves. We've had ministers appear before the committee, but in reality, most of it's done at that sort of, the commissioner of the RCMP, director of CSIS, deputy ministers, etc., that they can be frank and open with us, because they know they're not going to be politically attacked, or the words are going to be misconstrued, and you have that opportunity to sort of just be frank and honest. So I think that's the strength of this committee, and it's been a privilege. I've been on it now almost 4 years. I love being there, just because, I think I have the right background to bring that, because at the same time, having been a former operator on the military side and been working in this realm for decades, I can challenge and ask some very specific questions that, if you were on it, Dan, then I know you'd be a phenomenal addition to the committee, but your background's different, so yes, you're going to ask different types of questions. And so by having a mix of the representation on that committee, I think helps. But as I said, I firmly believe in the role. I think it's, there's question marks when it was first formed, but I think it's proved its value immensely, and just trying to, provide that recommendations from our reports to whichever party's in government to say, hey, here's a flag. We have an issue here, and let's fix this. At the same time, it's that education role to Parliament and to Canadians to say, hey, here's something that needs to be addressed, that we should all be aware of, and here's how we can make improvements.
Well, that's very reassuring that the committee process has been developed and that you as a member feel that it is a good process and is doing more. Now, in regards to not just flagging, but you said also educating both Parliament as well as the general public. One thing that the public often struggles with is the idea of a security clearance. So people sometimes assume that if someone has clearance, they can literally see everything, or the government must give them whatever they ask for. From your experience, Alex, can you explain what a security clearance is, and just as importantly, what it doesn't entitle someone to?
So a security clearance, there's almost arguably 2 or 3 parts to it. So first off, why do you need a security clearance? Well, we have government bureaucrats, but it's not just government bureaucrats, it's actually ministers, it's people in government, because they need to know, right? So it's this first test is you can't really get a security clearance without having a requirement to potentially have access to classified information. Now, information goes through multiple levels of classification and protection, right? So on the personal information side, so if you're dealing with Service Canada or CRA, a lot of your information will either be protected A, so like for example, your social insurance number, a lot of times that could be, some people might say it's protected B, but it's protected A. It's information you don't want to be sharing with the general public because it allows access to certain information about you as an individual. Protected B, it's more personal, that you should be keeping that even higher. And then protected C is health information, for example. That's different than classified information, which then really sort of goes through a confidential sort of, there's different words that they use, but normally it's confidential. So it's important, it needs to be close hold. It's not going to have necessarily grave consequences if that information was to get released publicly. Then it goes to a level called secret, which again, grave consequences to our potential national security, to people, to capabilities, et cetera. And then top secret, that really has those really massive, injurious kind of issues that if it was to become public. And even within the top secret, there is multiple compartments. So even if you have that security clearance, doesn't mean you get access to it. So that gets to the next step. So, but even before you get access, first you got to demonstrate you have a requirement to apply for a security clearance. Then secondly, you have to pass that security clearance, which is basically you giving permission to law enforcement, all the national security organizations that potentially are feeding into that. Now, interesting enough, each of the departments sort of manage that process internally, like there's standards that Treasury Board establishes, however, to track it and do everything. But then you got to successfully do it. So you're basically given, a credit check, criminal record check, all of that type stuff, and depending on how high you're going, in a personal one-on-one interview, and then it's even more stringent for top secret. But then once you have it, it just means that, and again, normally at secret level means most things, they don't compartmentalize it as much, but at the same time, you don't get access to something just because you have a clearance. You actually have to demonstrate that your position or job has a need to know. That's the need to know principle. And this is even more apparent at the top secret level. And so just to how this all ties together, I maintained my top secret security clearance when I retired from the military because I didn't know if I was going to be successful in winning my nomination back home or even then getting elected. Because of my background, where am I likely going to go get a job? Likely in the defense contracting, defense consulting industry. So I transferred my security clearance before, as I was retiring from the military, to a couple civilian contractors or civilian companies, defense companies, to say, can you hold this? So then they register with PSPC to say, hey, Alex Ruff is, we have him on our file. Here's his top secret security clearance that he currently has. Please transfer it and associate it with us. Again, it's only good for 5 years. Secret's good for 10 years before you got to renew it and go through the whole process again. So I maintain that. But I still had it current for the next 3 or 4 years as a member of Parliament. And I even talked about this during our debate around when the Trudeau government had introduced the Emergencies Act and invoked it, our most draconian piece of legislation. And I talked about it in a speech I gave when we were debating that in the chamber to say, look, if there is a legit national security threat here, why aren't you briefing individuals like myself that had a current top secret security clearance or former privy councillors within our party?
Yes.
Because unfortunately at that time the Liberal government had lost so much trust with the Canadian populace and with parliamentarians that them just saying trust us wasn't good enough for Canada and Canadians. But I'm confident in saying that if they had briefed me on what the so-called, if the threats had been legitimate at that national security level, if I'd walked into our caucus room and told our caucus members, look, we actually got to support this. I've seen I can't tell you the details because again, that's the whole idea behind the security clearances. You can't share this with people, but do you trust me? I think that would have gone over farther. Now, ultimately, I don't think they ever met that threshold, as we've seen with some of the court decisions. It was never been justified. I think they well overstepped their bounds, but it's just an example that despite having a top secret security clearance, the government never shared anything with me. Obviously, even now as a member of NSICOP, we, despite having the highest clearances literally in the country, excluding some very sensitive compartments, we don't get access to whatever we want. It has to be within the mandate of the review or the study that we're currently doing, and then therefore we can ask through the secretariat that supports the committee to ask for that information and then demand it when we have people appearing before us. So it's a very deliberate process to safeguard, as I said, the different information. And really the difference between secret and top secret is top secret really protecting the sources. How did we get that intelligence or information? And because again, whether that's through people that we have working somewhere or that that are supporting us, whether that's through an ally or whether that's through some technical capability, because again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier in the podcast. It's about protecting that. So that's really the key element, the layman's way to explain sort of as information becomes more and more sensitive.
So obviously there's standardized forms of categorization for different types of information, and then it matters who you are in context to that, whether or not you get access and whether or not the government wants to bring you into that category of information. So online, we constantly see questions being raised about, does the Leader of the Opposition have security clearance? Does the Prime Minister have security clearance? First of all, Ian Brody, had tweeted out that Justin Trudeau never had a security clearance because he was elected Prime Minister. He was given access to all those things because we're a democracy. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about this debate online, what's right, what's wrong, and maybe get us some facts.
So it's a little gray, so I had to ask a lot of questions. I've submitted a number of OPQs and got some clarity. So Ian Brody, 100% accurate. Former Prime Minister Trudeau, as far as I'm aware, never went through the same level of vetting that I would go through to get a security clearance. What happens for the Prime Minister, by virtue of being appointed the leader, or elected as the leader of the respective party, and then after a federal election by having the most time, is there, becomes the Prime Minister, de facto is the top dog when it comes to directing, and actually has the ability to declassify stuff, or Cabinet does, way easier than anybody can. Again, there's lots of officials that will recommend don't do this, don't share this, etc. But once you get put into Cabinet, you do there. Now, that being said, before somebody's appointed to Cabinet, if the Prime Minister is doing his job and PCO is doing their job and PMO, they are going to inquire through all the different national, whether it's the RCMP, through CSIS, through public safety, whatever, to say, hey, Dan Elbis, we want to make him a minister, Alex Ruff, we want to make him a minister. We're going to go through a vetting, they're going to vet our files, right? So again, something Trudeau was never a minister in a previous government, automatic, got there. However, when you look at current members of our caucus and teams, like our current leader, Mr. Poilievre, he's a former cabinet minister. He was vetted. And funny enough, through an order paper question, what Prime Minister Harper had done during his regime, he had actually changed it to, I think, every 2 years. He demanded that cabinet ministers and their spouses go through that vetting process.
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years. Something Prime Minister Trudeau changed in 2019, that once you're appointed to cabinet, as long as you stay in cabinet, you don't have to actually be re-vetted.
Okay, so there's a difference between each prime minister and how they set things up.
How they can set things, well, I think they had to do it through an order of council to change those rules, but or however, to realign, but again, I could share the OPQs on the public record that I asked a couple years back on this specific example. So a cabinet minister, however, when a cabinet minister is done, they, again, because they no longer have a need to know, it's not like my security clearance that I've got through the military or now through as a member of NSICOP, where it's through the normal Treasury Board sort of process. You get cleared, you waive parliamentary privilege, you swear an oath, you do a whole bunch of different things that basically says that if you ever speak to this stuff, you could go to jail. I know in my case, up to 14 years if I was to release something that I'm not authorized to release or talk about that's classified. For cabinet ministers, slightly different process. They do swear an oath of allegiance kind of deal, but it's not the same oath. Cabinet ministers do not waive any of their parliamentary privileges.
So just on parliamentary privilege, can you just say what that is in a nutshell?
As for your listeners to know, and for any of us, when we're debating normally in the House of Commons on normal stuff, even myself, as long as it's not information that I've obtained through my role with NSICOP, or in my case through the military as well, I can say basically whatever I want in the House, and I'm free from being sued or charged criminally for what we say in the chamber, right? In the chamber.
In the chamber.
So it's important that we have the freedom to say whatever. There's the shortfalls with that, as you're aware, because as we've constantly, you see, and we can't challenge the government, and vice versa. Sometimes that if it's an opposition colleague, if you say something that's not truthful, that is blatantly a lie, you can't call them out for that because we have parliamentary decorum or sort of precedent set there, but we do challenge it. But you can't be charged. You can't be, whether it's civilly or criminally. So that's really what parliamentary privilege allows us to protect what we say in there. However, I've waived that, from the military and obviously as a member of NSICOP. Ministers, it'd be fascinating if a minister stands up and or especially the prime minister, they can basically release something that's classified and they're good to go, right? There's not going to be a charge, do that because they've never waived that right through the way that they obtain access, because by virtue of their appointment as a cabinet minister, to that classified information. So this is where the nuance exists. Getting leaders of the opposition, and this is where, even when the foreign interference sort of issue raised its ugly head, and there was a lot of stuff that was leaked to the media, and it was being debated in the public sphere, what Trudeau offered to the leaders of the opposition parties was to basically go through a normal clearance process and waive certain privileges in order to get access just to the stuff that I had virtue of an ability to see, and the same information that at that time the Special Rapporteur David Johnston had got access to. And as former NDP leader Tom Mulcair stated, and I fully agree with it, I did not agree with Mr. Poilievre submitting himself to that sort of hand tying, because this was a public issue. Now, can he get a security clearance and never get read in on some of this stuff that's public? Absolutely. So there's a balance that can be obtained here, but it's not, I have zero concerns about, as I said, as somebody that's studied and looked at this, I have zero concerns about any of the leaders of the opposition parties about getting access to anything.
Yes. So just to maybe tie this issue up in a bow, essentially, doesn't matter if it's Pierre Poilievre or another leader of the opposition, they can, if they went through the process that at the time that Prime Minister Trudeau offered, where they would basically make the same declaration that you've done, and essentially it would mean that they would waive their parliamentary privilege. So who ultimately decides when someone breaks that? It violates that.
So it would go through your normal sort of investigative process. It's not politicians that are going to decide that. It would be, through the RCMP, that all law enforcement would ultimately have to say, here's the allegation that's been flagged. this information was classified, that whoever this, whether it's one of us that's a member of the NSICOP, whether it's a leader of the opposition, or anybody that how did they obtain that information? What were the conditions imposed on them? So it would go through that sort of same, sort of no different than anything. An allegation's been made, an investigation, an inquiry must be done by our independent law enforcement to determine, has that threshold, has that line been crossed? And again, where it'd be easy to challenge or charge one of the leaders of the opposition parties, going back to the example we're using, would be, well, they don't have access to any of that stuff unless it's been given there. Now, that being said, each of the opposition parties during an election can have all the recognized parties can get 2 members of their party with a secret security clearance that the, task force that's put together for every federal election can share stuff with them, and this is something that so there are other ways, but it ultimately comes down to how did that person get that information and whether they've compromised something that they've sworn to.
Okay. So do you think right now that there's the proper balance, though, where again, if someone wants to waive those parliamentary privileges and operate under those rules, they can. If someone else is better designated to take that role, to me, it would make no sense, as Tom Mulcair said, to basically tie your hands as the lead challenge function for our government, where you
for Canadians,
exactly, because Canadians need to know that someone can ask the questions and not feel that they can be
So is the
denied.
balance right? I think there's always improvements that can be made, which will come into my private members bill that I tabled last Parliament. But ultimately, for the leaders of the opposition, nothing stopped when Prime Minister Harper or previous prime ministers to him that if there's an imminent threat and a reason to make sure, again, around the sense of unity, around a national threat, that hopefully I can remember the term that both CSIS or the RCMP can use. It's a threat reduction measure, a TRM. They're allowed to provide Dan Elbis, who has no secret security clearance or hey, there's a threat against your family being targeted maybe from a foreign state, maybe just a criminal organization, terrorists, who knows. They can come brief you on some very classified information through what's called a threat reduction measure. Same thing applies right now, that there's nothing stopping the Prime Minister, one of the Minister of Public Safety, to go to any MP or anything for an imminent threat, right? And again, even some of the benefits that's come out of Bill C-70, prior to Bill C-70, CSIS which was the government response to our foreign interference report and some of the stuff on that, CSIS could not share information outside the federal bureaucracy, the federal public service. They couldn't share it with industry, they couldn't share it with municipal or provincial governments. Now, C-70, that we fast-tracked through Parliament at the time, allows CSIS to do that. So it allows them it gives them more tools, and so the same thing applies to us as parliamentarians. Again, to what level, without a classification, and so this leads into why I decided to table a private member's bill last Parliament.
Okay. Now, before we get to your private member's bill, I just want to quickly turn to foreign interference. So, as you referenced earlier, Canadians were shaken when it became public that 11 parliamentarians were referenced in relation to a foreign interference report done by your committee. So, without breaching any confidentiality, what can you say about NSICOP, how they handle issues like this? How should Canadians understand the difference between allegations, intelligence, and verified misconduct?
So again, nuances, a couple things. So our report never once mentions 11 members of Parliament. That is something the media reported on through some sort of leak. I don't know where that number 11 exactly comes from. That I can attest, read our report, that the number 11 doesn't appear in our report from anything that we've drawn attention to. And in fact, we don't name members of Parliament or senators or any parliamentarians, with the exception of one, I believe. I think there's just one named in it that was part of something that was already public against those allegations at that time. Former member now. Ultimately, those allegations, are out there. it goes back to what I said earlier. We studied this all. We didn't really care as a committee to know the specific names of individuals because that wasn't our, where is the shortfall here within our democratic processes that need to be fixed and identified? Because we're not, in fact, as I said, if there's an active law enforcement investigation, we can no longer look at that specific issue because the Act makes that crystal clear. So ultimately, we chose, and this is where there's a bit of difference between the public inquiry or not, is we chose to use because it was something that based on our read as parliamentarians of the evidence and the intelligence and the information that we were provided, that we looked at it and we purposely chose to use the words witting and unwitting because sometimes parliamentarians that are being influenced by a foreign state through another third actor, they may not even know that it's exactly going on. But we chose the word wittingly because in our opinion as practice practitioners of, democracy, as to say, when we looked at what was provided us, that MP or that senator should have known better. This crosses what we viewed as an unacceptable line. The challenge we face in Canada goes back to changes in law. So before C7, there was no actual formal charge in the criminal code of foreign interference. So how do you charge somebody? And the next thing goes back to something that's question mark around and even ties to stuff like lawful access, and you'll see it in our report. I think in that foreign interference report, it's paragraph either 164 or 168 that anybody online can go in, is until government or legislation changes to ensure that our source information and how that information is protected within the court proceedings when an allegation is made against somebody, whether they're parliamentarian or not, it's going to be very difficult to see charges laid because law enforcement, CSIS, whatever organization that was able to get that information that's extremely sensitive, unless that they know they can protect, if it's an ally, a person that they have somewhere or the capability in a court proceeding, at the same time given due diligence. And our charter in Canada is adding to the complexity of this compared to some of our like-minded allies across the Western democracy. So that's why it's still not totally there. I think it is something I'd love to see the current government or a future government tackle, is I actually think we need to put more clear delineation around the protection process so that you're not, the person, the alleged perpetrator is still given due a process, presumed innocent until proven guilty, etc. But at the same time, that there's some way of having that safeguard measure in place to say, look, Alex, you've done the following. Well, how do you know that? Sorry, we've had a separate justice or judge, look at it and prosecution defense. However, not tied directly to look at it and go, no, this information, it needs to be protected. The evidence is overwhelming. In our that this is accurate. You can't challenge this. This is basically the gospel in doing that. So until all of that gets fixed and firmly or tested, because there's lawyers that will make the case, the privacy lawyers, that the protections do exist within our justice system, but there's never been a case or a willingness yet to firmly put it to the test because of the potential consequences. So it's finding that fine balance that still, I think we don't have sort of a trial case or precedent set here in Canada that firmly puts that in place on how to find that balance.
So for those individuals, I know thinking of a few people in my riding that believe that those media reports around 11 parliamentarians, what would you say to their frustrations that ultimately to them it feels like there's no finality, because quite honestly, this shook a lot of people's confidence in our system.
So look, more needs to be done. As I said, Bill C-70 addressed some aspects of it. What we just finished talking about, until we firmly fix this aspect of protecting source information and making sure our justice system can do that, I don't know if we'll ever have sort of, finality put around this issue. At the same time, there's lots more little stuff that, again, as I said, C70 is going to allow. I think there's more that governments can do, more than parliamentarians can do, and it even speaks to why I put my P&B forward, on why I think it's important, because it's part of the solution.
So let's talk about that right now. So in your own words, what does the bill do, and what is the problem you're trying to solve?
So the problem I'm trying to solve is having mature adult discussions around national security, and actually to inform those of us that are privileged to be parliamentarians to have a frank, honest dialogue and understand the risks and threats that are posed to Canada's democracy, right? And to everything, to what our Canadians face. Democratically, we got to allow Canadians to do what they want. However, I feel parliamentarians should at least have that choice. So to apply for a security clearance, just a secret security clearance. I'm not talking, top secret. I'm just talking secret. So I purposely drafted that my private member's bill, which unfortunately died in the, in the process last Parliament, was to allow parliamentarians, whether senators or MPs, to apply for a secret security clearance. That's it. It doesn't handcuff the government to say you need to waive parliamentary privilege. It doesn't handcuff the government to say how they're going to put safeguards in place. It's just saying Dan Elbus can apply for a secret security clearance, and that's it. If he passes or fails, that is doesn't predict how it's going to play out. And even once you've successfully obtained a secret security clearance, it does not guarantee you access to any information or the process that would put in place. So that's all I want it to do.
Absolutely. When I was a parliamentary secretary, I did receive clearance, but it was only the documents that the minister's office, the minister felt was important for me to know, and that's how that system works. So, so ultimately, what was the reaction to your bill from both parliamentarians and outside of the House?
For the most part, outside there wasn't pushback. There's always some pushback online, et cetera, like that. But within the House, I was a little bit disappointed that I didn't get more support from some of the Liberals, but I did get cross-party support from all the opposition parties, and I did get it from 3 Liberal MPs at the time, including a couple that were parliamentary secretaries. So because of minority parliament, it did get to committee. When we heard the feedback from some of the officials, some of the wording, because I used the word need to know as part of the title and some of the language, and they said, no, this is concerning to them because, again, it sort of applies to the first step, but it's more tied to the third step about how you get information. So they were concerned about that. So I addressed a couple of those concerns. I moved amendments at committee when we were at committee. One that got accepted, by everybody there, but then unfortunately, the Liberal members of the Proc Committee basically behind doors did a deal with the NDP and the Bloc to basically try to put into my bill, which was, if you were to look at it, if you ignore the preamble, was 2 sentences long, 2 changes to the Parliament of Canada Act, and added in about another page of here's how we're going to do this. This is how you're going to get sworn in. This is what, and I'm like, stop, because as you know, maybe all your listeners don't. We're debating this at the Proc Committee with a very small group of members. It's then going to go back for second reading if I would have allowed those amendments to pass. And you got 2 more hours of debate where nobody can actually ask questions or challenge anything, because the only person that can speak and get questions to is myself as the sponsor of that bill. And so you're not going to have proper debate. And to be frank, if those amendments would have got through, I'm confident in stating it would have not been, that Conservative private member's bill from Alex Ruff would not have been supported by my own colleagues in our Conservative caucus, and I would have voted against it itself. So I made sure those amendments that they tried to force through did not get through at Proc. So the bill actually got reported back to the House as unamended. I would have reintroduced the amendments to address the legitimate concerns that the officials had brought forward to make the bill even better had Parliament not been prorogued and then the election called. So now I have fully intentions of retabling that bill, but unfortunately I'm so far down the order of precedence It will never and it'll never get debated during this Parliament under my name. We'll see if one of our colleagues want to pick it up. But again, I just want to, it's all about getting back, because what was the intent behind this? It's great that we can have that at NSICOP, but I actually feel that committees like Foreign Affairs, SECU, the Public Safety Committee, or the National Defense Committee, all within the House, there's quite frequently when they have officials testifying and the questions go down a certain path, and then they say, well, sorry, but we can't share that. You guys don't have the right clearances. It would then enable, there'd be some resources tied to this that they'd have to go, not just in camera, they got to make sure the room's secured properly, no devices, etc., to then have that conversation. And of course, but I think it would actually reduce partisanship within the House, and it would allow MPs or senators, when it's going on in the Senate, to actually have this discussion or debate around whatever that threat or risk or issue may be. It could be, around industrial sabotage or IP concerns around a foreign state buying into some of our critical natural resource sectors, like whatever you want, what it could be. But if you actually had the officials in there, it's like, well, here's what we know. Again, just at that secret level, you could have a much more informed conversation, which would then allow that committee, those parliamentarians, to then put forward the findings and recommendations in an unclassified means back into the public viewpoint. And it would reassure Canadians that this isn't just whatever political stripe of government that's in power saying, we must do this, and this is, going to take away your rights, or this is going to do this or that. It's like, you know what? All, like, cross-party consensus on some of these issues, and the light bulb will go on, and I've seen it, right? Because again, we've come from different political backgrounds on NSICOP, but some of the committee members, whether they're from the Bloc, the NDP, even some of the senators that come from, on the opposite side of the spectrum as ourselves, that the light bulb goes on, because again, that isn't their background, but now they realize, holy geez, this is what these threats are, and this is why we need to put certain, restrictions or pass legislation that does it. So I'm just a big believer that the more you are transparent with parliamentarians, the more we can be transparent with Canadians as well, as the representatives for them.
Alex, you've been really good with giving us so much of your time and input here, but just maybe we can finish on a note, because I know this is an important issue to you, but if you could just change one thing on how Canada debates these national security issues, one improvement that would help us tackle these challenges with more clarity and less politics, what would it be?
It's exactly that. It's my bill, right? Yeah. It's if you allow parliamentarians to get a security clearance, and those that are successful partake in that debate, and unfortunately it means you got to do some of this behind closed doors so that the public doesn't see it, but by doing it and informing them, that then allows us, so, as a member that had a former security clearance and as somebody that has a current one, but we could actually sit down, if we were both informed about whatever the issue may be, we can actually have a public discussion. It's tricky to make sure you're not crossing that threshold, but we can now have a much more public discussion and, together, even if we were on opposite sides of the floor, to debate an issue going, well, yes, we agree, but without getting into specifics, here's what about this, what about that, but you're now both coming from a position of education and being informed, and you're not just talking about it based on what you think might exist or what somebody's reported on in the media or what you're just hearing. So I think it's really that. I think as much as I'm a big believer in transparency and accountability, I think there's certain things that if we were to shut the cameras off, have these higher level discussions of the facts, that then when we're back in public, it would, just around national security issues in particular, we'd be able to have a more informed debate, and it would actually benefit not only us as parliamentarians, but it would benefit our nation and all Canadians.
Well, Alex, I'm really glad the cameras have been on for this discussion, because it's been clearly informative to me, and this is exactly what I was hoping for today. So I'd like to just finish off today by thanking Alex again for your service, and for all the insights. And what you've shared today, Alex, reminds us that national security isn't an abstract notion. It's the quiet work of people who carry heavy responsibilities with integrity, discipline, and a deep sense of duty. Your commitment to strengthening our democratic institutions, improving oversight, and ensuring Canadians stay safe is exactly the kind of leadership that inspires me. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on Conservative Solutions for Our Common Challenges. Behind every policy debate are people doing the real work. People who choose service over cynicism, solutions over posturing, and country over self. If today's conversation resonated with you, I hope you'll share it with someone you care about. I'm Dan Albus. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And we'll see you next time.